hold all of these different elements that will help you persuade. And so some of these end up being strategies that help with your logos or help with your ethos or help with pathos. And I had a couple of people email me asking for a clarification from the prompt, which was very astute of you. I said, don't use the terms ethos, logos, pathos, which might feel like you were just sort of kicked in the face of like, what? We've been spending all this time discussing it. But what that means is that we do not want to use just the term because it's such a broad term. If we say, oh yeah, this is pathos, it's like, okay, there's a lot of different types of pathos. Is it using emotional language? Is it bringing in this humanizing perspective? Is it bringing in universal human experience? Is it making the reader, feel really guilty? So those are the kinds of things that we should use instead of those kind of blanket terms. We're not using the drawer labels. We're using the stuff that's in the drawers. So even if, let's say, and we're going to talk about structure on Thursday, even if you decide you want to have a whole paragraph on logos, you're going to want to make sure that you just don't have a disjointed folder of various types of logos. It should still be pretty streamlined and specific, but we'll talk more about that later. For now, just focus on okay, what does make this logos? What does make this pathos? And so this will hopefully give you a lot more terminology that you can now go back to your annotated draft, your annotated article. You can go back to your the DEJ that you're building. This class session is going to have you add more onto that and start to broaden it out. So rhetorical strategies, again, some of those elements that will help us be persuasive. And so I need to make it clear just how many rhetorical terms, rhetorical strategies there are. So this is a book that is just like what I keep next to me all the time. And if you open it inside, it's just word after word after word after word after word. The A's alone take up 40 pages. And if you look closely, it's just a lot of Greek. The word anatomy, which is maybe the only word that looks familiar to us. Of course, that is derived from the Greek, and it doesn't mean human anatomy. So we are not learning all of these. There are things in here that I don't have memorized, and this is what I've done grad work in. It's very hard to memorize, and they get really, really specific. So instead of just something like, oh, it's repetition of a certain phrase, there's like at least 150 different terms that have to do with various types of repetition. So we're not going to go through that, especially because the book, even though this doesn't look thick, it's just word after word after word after word after word. So instead, I created some categories, and some of them use the actual term. You do not need to use the actual Greek term for these unless that's the only term that I give you on this. Most of them I just sort of broadened, or I created larger categories. So the first video is going to talk about diction. The second, which is going to be a lot shorter, is going to talk about structure. And then the last one, we'll discuss figurative language, that language that we use when we're being a little bit more creative. So we'll start with diction, and we know that diction is word choice. So we've kind of been playing around with that from like our lesson from 2 weeks ago, and that's been in the front of our head. We've been thinking about connotations, stuff like that. And so the first strategies you can use are kind of the most basic, which is just thinking about, do I want to use concrete language or do I want to use abstract language? And concrete is typically what we like. So if you have trouble figuring out what the difference between those two are, I think about how you perceive concrete. Concrete is a physical thing. You can touch it, you could sit on it, you can listen to it, you can lick it if you want. I wouldn't suggest that. You can see it, obviously. So things that you can perceive in your senses. So when we're able to see something, if we go back to our logos lecture, you're more likely to believe it. And we're constantly creating this running sort of video play in our heads when people are telling us things, because we, for those of us who are, are sighted or have been sighted, we do see things in that kind of form. So when you're able to use specific language, you are able to help people connect something logically. Maybe you've had that experience where someone's explaining what to do and you ask, can you show me? Or can you describe like where that thing goes in, or how you attach that part to that part. It's very helpful for us to have the specifics. And so you can use even things like emotions, or we connect to it emotionally, and use sort of sensory terms to help that happen. So an example of this, we could say food, and I'm going to say that's like, yes, it is concrete. Food is concrete. We can touch it. We can eat it. We love it. But when I imagine food, there are so many different images that I have in my head. And if you're trying to communicate to me something very specific, you ate some food, I'm not going to understand what's going on in your head, because food, I have my own idea of what food is. Maybe I am thinking about shawarma, but you are thinking about Mexican food. So it'd be actually easier if you say Mexican food. And now I'm like, okay, my focus is a little bit shifted down. I can now, envision that. However, there are so many different types of Mexican food. So you clarify and you say, oh, it was a burrito. Great. That's a lot more specific. I have sort of a generic image of a burrito in my head. But if you wanted to communicate exactly what you were eating, you would probably tell me what type of burrito it was. It was a California burrito. And so this is so much more helpful when communicating than if you're just saying food. So the more specific we are, the less effort that your reader, that your audience has to take to understand. And a lot of times readers or your audience will just not pay attention if something is intentionally vague. Think about lectures you've been in that are really boring. A lot of times it's because there's not a lot of specific language that activates those visual sensory elements in your brain. And so it's literally hard to follow along. So I am always going through, I hate Twitter, but I go on there just to see how people are using language. It's an amazing language factory. We'll be looking at Twitter a lot more, and Instagram when we talk about rhetorical fallacies next week, which is my favorite, arguments gone wrong. So I was looking at obviously I've been very interested in what's been going on with you international students, and trying to figure out what we're going to do next semester. Thank every god or deity or animal or whatever that now that is rescinded, so we can all breathe a little bit easier. But this person was tweeting back at the president, and she used a lot of specific incidents: arresting DACA, commuting Stone, concrete name Stone, Roger Stone, shredding COVID task force, gives actual numbers. So this is why Logos is so great, because usually it's specific stuff, it's evidence. And so this appeals to us, whether you agree with it or not. We at least know what she's talking about. Her argument's very clear. It could also be giving examples. So this person was giving an example of her husband's experience with the COVID illness, and how it's not just people who are older who get it. And she gave a lot of specifics. She said that he's an ICU MD. She said it was a 32-year-old woman, 16 hours, full PPE. I actually don't know what that is, but I really should. So she gives specifics, which we understand now exactly what her position is. And this also gives her a little bit more ethos too. It shows that she knows what she's talking about. So concrete language is really what we want to use when we're in an academic setting or in a work setting. Abstract is still important, not as important for what we're doing in this class, but it is good to be able to recognize it too. You may notice areas where the article that you're reading becomes a little bit more abstract, and we can stop and say, why is that? Why have they chosen to abstract this thing? And so when you are abstract, you are trying to connect to humanity in some way. You're not trying to convey a certain idea. You are trying to make that person feel connected to you. And so if concrete's all about logos, abstract is all about pathos. So we can remember abstract if we think about abstract art. Maybe you have gone to take a date to a museum. Maybe you've gone up to LACMA, which is a great date museum, I will tell you. And in their modern and postmodern wing, they have paintings like this. These are from Mark Rothko. I love him. But if you look at it, it is not like a Renaissance painting of a horse. Like, that is clearly a horse. This, you could have two totally different ideas about it. I could look at this and say, oh, it's the sunset. And then my date could say, no, it's a hamburger. or a Doritos Locos Taco. Like it, and neither of you are really right. You're able to read into this because it's intentionally vague. And so if you think about things like song lyrics or poetry, all of that is supposed to make you put yourself into that situation. And so they'll say like something like love. And maybe the love that you're thinking of is the love of family, whereas your friend is thinking of the love of a cat, whereas your other friend is thinking of the love of their partner. So those words, it's not wrong. It's not a bad argument. It certainly just opens things up. So your purpose is different when you're using abstract language. An example of that is this tweet by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, where her message was, "Nothing is more important than the safety of our children. We can ensure America's children will be safe with an actionable plan, not magical thinking. The purpose of this is to make people feel better. The purpose is not to convey active information. It's not to explain how children will be safe. And it also just makes us feel better. Like, oh, okay, good. You guys do care about the safety of children returning to school." So that vagueness for this moment, it's not wrong. I think the purpose of being on a lot of times the news is to just give that message out to people. And you can think whatever you want about the news. I'm not going to venture into that. But sometimes there's messages that you need to calm people down, and sometimes there's messages where you convey information. And so she chose at this moment to try to calm people. I've already spoken briefly about denotation. Denotation is just the dictionary definition, but it could also be you defining something, taking maybe one of those abstract terms or phrases and saying, okay, I know there's a lot of other terms for this or interpretations of this, but for the purpose of my argument, we're using it as this. And that's like one of the best power plays that you can have when you're in a classroom. Also, if you're talking about some big idea and you raise your hand and say, hey, can we define our terms? Your professors will just like weep internally, and they will love it. Good weeping. And so I've used the example before of the word feminism, how people hear feminism and some of them have a poorer connotation to that. They will think that it's man-hating when really that has another term, but society, language is malleable. And so society has interpreted feminism in many ways as something more man-hating, which, by the way, if you do have a Twitter account and you like words, Merriam-Webster is a very wonderful account, and they clap back a lot at people and stuff in the news. I think my favorite was after Kylie Jenner was pronounced self-made billionaire. Their definition of the day was self-made, and basically disproving that Kylie Jenner was self-made. Please no one come at me for that. But there's power in that of saying, no, actually, let's look at this thing. Let's look at this source that tells us that this is what this thing is. And so at the beginning of this writing lab, asked you guys to just take a quick gander over at this short opinion piece that was posted about a week and a half ago. And obviously very within the context of what's going on. People are taking down memorials, figuring out, like, should we have, Confederate statues? People saying, no, it's part of our history. Why would we erase it? And then other people saying, like, well, there's no Nazi, statues in Berlin, and people still remember the history fine. It's a very interesting argument with a lot of different sides. It's very complicated. And so this stuck with me because it was by Jefferson's sixth great grandson. I think it's sixth. And so instantly my brain went off on this ethos alert. And so I wanted to show it to you guys. And so I'm going to be using this as an example as I work through the paper that you guys are writing. So at every stage, I'm also going to be writing a paper with you. I'm not going to write the very final thing, but I am going to have a really in-depth outline so you can see exactly what my plan is for this paper. And I personally think, at least for me writing, outlines are so helpful for me if I could see what that professor has in mind, not taking their ideas, because obviously using a different text. But sometimes it's nice to see, oh yeah, I'm on the right track. That's what this is doing. So most of our papers and projects from here going out, I'm going to try to have that sample for you guys. And so the culmination of this whole, you read it, of this article, is that it should be Harriet Tubman instead. And one of the last lines was taking this definition of Harriet Tubman and not just as a freed slave, which is how people have normally described or defined her, creator of the Underground Railroad, but he instead said who was a slave but also a patriot. And then took Jefferson, didn't even give him a name, and said a white man who enslaved hundreds of men and women. So in this moment, he was completely restructuring and defining how he wanted you to think about these two people. There's a lot of power in doing that, even though it's not dictionary definition. Of course, we talked about connotation, which is the feeling or the idea or image that's evoked by a certain word. Sometimes that is broadly from everybody in society, like a black cat. We have those sort of connotations with it, or it's something specific to different cultures. And we're going to talk about juxtaposition in a little bit, but again, language is malleable. I go back to this a lot, how Islam changed meanings for a lot of people, at least in the US. It's an inherently peaceful religion. And the more that we used it in a context like this, the more we sandwich this word in between two words that are very negative. Radical is extreme. We don't like that. Radical feminism, radical, evangelicalism, radical politically. Same with how we use alt left or alt right. We don't like that. It means that you're not really thinking clearly. Even though I love using the word rad because I'm like a child of the late 80s. And of course, terror has a terrible connotation. And so there's power in putting it between these two. It starts to seep in. And so even if you remove this word, Islamic, it's still going to have the residue of radical and terror on it, which is why so many people are able to read Islamic and then associate it only with very specific acts of violence that are not representative of Islam as a whole. In my article, I found a couple things, and one, I hesitated to call it connotation, but as I was reading, he's just going through this history of like how he beat his grandparents and they would drive him to the memorial into Monticello. And they dropped Charlottesville in here. And so whether it was intended or not, my brain instantly thought of the alt-right riots that happened where a woman was killed. I think just one woman was killed, counter-protesting. And so instantly that kind of like put this little cloud over this of like, oh man, that's right. We're like in this zone, like this is the past, but these same names are very closely linked with like now contemporary like racial fear and unrest. A lot of it was intentional, though. So when he was talking about being the great-grandson of a slave owner, he very intentionally emphasized slave owner instead of the number of other things he could call his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And even this word owned. Our great-grandfather owned their great-grandmother. My family owned their family. That's such a harsh way to word it that, of course, is completely accurate. But that word choice is intentional. It's supposed to make us feel uncomfortable. So you have options with connotation. You can soften the words that you use, or you can sharpen them, and it completely depends on your purpose. A lot of the people that you're reading have intentionally softened some things to make it more palatable for people, whereas others, at least in my article, and I definitely know, I think in over half of the articles that you guys are reading, there's a lot of things that are sharpened for emphasis, words that maybe you could have used a different, like a synonym for, but you've chosen this one instead. When we think of softening, I don't know if anybody I don't know who reads the news in our class and who doesn't. I obviously stay up on it. So Ivanka Trump launched a campaign called Find Something New that's addressing rampant unemployment in the U.S. right now due to COVID closures. And it's a very fascinating website because it's just sort of a Create American Jobs site, just repackaged in this way. But the whole thing is addressing what is a very stressful point in people's lives right now, having their entire industries ransacked. For example, my best friend works in theater in New York City, and there's no theater at least until 2021. So she's completely out of a job. And so this site is there for people to like find ways. The word that they use a lot is reskill, which I I need to formulate my thoughts more, but I think it's kind of a problematic term. But it uses all of these euphemisms around being unemployed, and full disclosure, I think that this is, I'm not a fan of it. I think it's kind of dangerous and a little misleading. But it's trying to get people to like get rid of, lose their old industry where there's no jobs and make up for it in another one. But this is on the front page, and it's loaded with this very euphemistic language. Find a new way forward. So it's not finding a new job. It's not, getting a paycheck. It's a new way forward. Very positive language. Not saying that jobs are diminishing, saying they're changing. They're not gone. They're just changing. Whether you're entering the workforce for the first time or need to pivot and retrain, also more neutral language, rather than like what I think a lot of us call it, which is starting all over again. And I don't know if you're having conversations with your partners or with your parents. I know some of our students have lost jobs. I'd say half of the people I know have lost jobs or are just out of work for a while. This isn't the language that I'm seeing from people who've had this happen. This seems like a very, very nice veneer on this experience, talking about the fast track, getting something in demand, calling it exploring your options. And so a lot of language used in here is like a little, I don't want to say spiritual, but saying, hey, actually, this is a good opportunity for you. This is a great time for you to be rethinking all of these things, when most people are not having a great idea. Even the word path here, which I underlined, it does make this seem like part of a journey rather than what a lot of people are doing now, which is like completely restructuring their lives. So softening language. A lot of times softening language uses identification, which is just overwhelmingly positive language, which is just supposed to subconsciously make you feel better towards that person. So if anybody remembers the 2016 election, I can't remember if I talked about this or not yet. Not being in the classroom just means I forget what I've lectured on and what I haven't. If you watch the debates in the 2016 election, there's no need to go back and rewatch them. Don't do that to yourself. But while Donald Trump used mainly fear-based language, which we'll look at that with fallacies, Hillary Clinton used identification. She had overwhelmingly positive language that was supposed to make you feel positive towards her. And even though that identification was very powerful, very well done, your like fear will always trump that. Anything that has to do with basic safety is going to counteract any sort of positivity or any like good feelings. So this was a quote from Obama. Obama was had incredible speech writers, and so a lot of his speeches were modeled after Martin Luther King Jr., who is like the ultimate daddy of 20th century rhetoric. He's just what everybody bases it off of, and we'll look at a couple lines of his too. So I think this might be from the first inauguration speech. I can't remember. It says, "My parents shared not only an improbable love, they shared an abiding faith in the possibilities of this nation. They imagined me going to the best schools in the land, even though they weren't rich, because in a generous America, you don't have to be rich to achieve your potential." So obviously that's a really nice sentiment, period. But it's also loaded with kind of like these little positivity bombs also. Parents is something, it evokes family. Generally, that's positive. Maybe not for everybody. Share is positive. Love, maybe even improbable. Share again, abiding, faith, possibilities. Nation for most people evokes patriotism. Imagine is positive. Best. Even land, I think we could argue, is positive. Rich, generous, rich again, achieve, potential, all of these things. A lot of your language too, my, your. It makes us feel good when we read it. And that has a very powerful effect on people listening. A super important one is labeling. And this is using connotation, using denotation, and controlling the emotional response that people will have to an idea. So you choose certain words and you stick with those. So it's this weird little mix of like a powerful denotation using connotation. So it's kind of like you're repackaging a product, and then using more loaded language to get the effect that you want. I think the most famous of all of these is undocumented workers versus illegal aliens. I don't think I have to tell you which one has a more negative connotation. Of course, that's illegal aliens. We can break that up. Illegal, negative or positive word? Negative, obviously. Aliens, negative or positive? Typically negative. Historically, we've used aliens during wartime more than anything. And also, like, we could just read the room. We think about space aliens, and it's used in invading contexts. Versus undocumented workers, these are more neutral words. I would even say that workers is positive. We really value work in the US. A lot of obviously other countries do too, but it's part of our whole like ethos of the American dream of the more you work hard, you're going to achieve it. So we value people who work hard. So workers has a slightly more positive connotation, and undocumented is just neutral. It's about the document. It's not about an action. It just sounds like, oh well, these people, they just like forgot to file a paper. Like, that's not a problem. Versus there's an action that these aliens, quote unquote, did, that is against the law. So we're dealing with something clerical versus something legal here. And people can use these labels intentionally. I will never use this phrase. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it's accurate. People do use it, though, to stoke more of that fear about people who immigrate or who are refugees. Another one that we don't talk about much, but if you're interested in the way that we package this, there's some great documentaries. I used to teach a rhetoric of documentaries class, and one that we watched was How to Die in Oregon. It's a little older, but it's all about the assisted suicide movement, which I think is now a little bit more widely available, but you take pills at your end of life and you're able to kind of control when you go, and it's for people who are obviously have terminal illnesses and things like that. So death with dignity is a little harsh, but it does sound better. Like, dignity is a very good word. And while watching this documentary, you could even just watch the trailer of it, and you'll notice the way that they talk about it. Their perspective is definitely pro death with dignity. And so they'll say things like, wouldn't you want the right to decide for yourself how you want to pass? Like, very euphemistic language, because death, of course, is a horrifically scary thing to most of us. So we don't feel good when we hear that word, or saying like, yeah, I just want to kill myself. That's very harsh to us. And so we don't like hearing that. Assisted suicide, again, sounds a little bit more clinical. It has the word suicide in there, which has a moral complication onto it, whereas just death doesn't. Death happens. Suicide is something intentional, and in many places, up until recently, was illegal. I don't really know how they would enforce that, because if you're already dead, but especially for people who attempted. And assisted, again, sounds a little bit, as I said, more clinical. And these I'm going to try to sneak in some of the words in here. You don't have to memorize these. I just feel like a bad rhetoric professor if I don't include them. So these are derived from specific classical, like we're talking 6th century BC terms. So oxysis, oh, I'm very bad at speaking Greek, is that heightened word, so the sharpening, and then diminutio is decreasing or lessening, which diminished, you could probably see, and maybe you saw the root of ox, so yeah, you could sometimes see that on like speakers and stuff with volume. So I found this in mine. It was this phrase, founding mothers. So I tried to classify. I thought there must be some kind of strategy that specifically talks about taking some phrase that's a common phrase, which we have, which is founding fathers, and then swapping it. And I knew there was, I spent like 2 hours last night looking for this. But by swapping, he's trying to change the way that we think about our history, and shift the narrative a little bit. And so he was labeling in this very specific way with a different connotation. And there is an element of shock in there. There's an element of pathos. So if we read that, we're like, oh, wow, he just did that. Of course, the media, very responsible for this too. We talked about this in one of our very first lectures on implicit bias. You can label people through images, through the words that you use. We joke about it now. I hate that we joke about things like school shootings, but we live in that society. Right now, the idea of black men being thugs, and if you're white for the same exact crime, you're a lone wolf or mental illness. Mental illness is brought up, but that doesn't seem to come up for people who are of color. It ends up being something else. So this is some old data, but I think this is from, I want to say 2017. In the mainstream news, terrorist was used 35 times to describe Muslim shooters, and black shooters also got that. White shooters only 17% of the time. I would say it's even less than that now. Thug was used 57 times, and I think this was for one specific crime. I really should have included the title. I feel like a bad professor here. White shooters rarely get called thugs, but mental illness, 80% of shooters or violent criminals are able to blame it on mental illness. 4% of Muslim shooters get the mental illness label. I saw this on Instagram the other day, and I thought this was Twitter, the other day. I thought it was great. People are trying to redefine our language talking about slavery. Maybe you've noticed that we now should say enslaved rather than they were slaves, focusing more on the action of the person who was the aggressor rather than just on the victim themselves. And so this guy translated these words, and it was very interesting because reading through these, I'm like, oh man, I feel weird, calling this a death camp, because I think of a death camp as like Auschwitz and Birkenau, but that's just because I live in a society that has called them plantations and focus on almost the romanticized nature of them. It's important to note that slavery was not that long ago. And so translated for a common phrase. So instead of slave families lived in plantations owned by white slave owners and hired overseers to maintain discipline, instead it's black families were held hostage in death camps by white human traffickers who employed torturers to torture and kill them. It is wildly different just by changing up the language. And so that's the power that labels have. That's the power that sharpening has. And I've used the word euphemism in here also, but anytime that you choose a softer or more elaborate term for something simple, instead of fake leather, genuine imitation leather. I get so tired of that. I've been hearing lately for poorer communities, culturally deprived environments where it's just not necessary. We should just say what we mean. It reminds me also, one of my closest friends is black, and she was talking about being black, and one of her colleagues said, "Don't say that, say African American." And she's like, "I'm actually black, it's okay to say." But euphemisms usually are for ourselves to feel better. And lastly, slogans. So slogans are expanded labels where they are not just this phrase, but this entire belief system. So the American dream is one of those. Support the troops. Make America Great Again is a perfect example because it was just a slogan that was used for a campaign. But it turned into that person's a MAGA person. And red hats turned into something that for many were scary, or for others who were Trump supporters, made them feel better and communal. So it's this thing that takes on more power and more ideas, so that you're labeling more than just one idea. It's a lot of stuff. I'm arguing that wear the mask is becoming that, but more than anything, Black Lives Matter. People use it as a verb, as a noun, as an adjective. It's become so much larger than just a thing to chant at protests. Now it is also used, historically, or saying, oh, well, this changed because of Black Lives Matter. Even though Black Lives Matter is not something that has a single origin point, or it wasn't a singular event. It's a very, rhetorically, it's a fascinating slogan, and I'm excited to see sort of how that moves historically.